Hey everyone, Assalamu alaikum. Welcome back to another episode with Fawakih Institute. As you know, for the last few weeks, we have been going around and interviewing different instructors, curriculum developers, as well as admin at Fawakih Institute. Today we're here with Fawakih's CEO, Saif Omar. Saif brings a very unique perspective to an educational institute that teaches Arabic, specifically because he comes from a background where he worked as a business consultant in the corporate world, left that behind, worked for different organizations until it culminated his experience into Fawakih. So today we're going to be talking to him. Assalamu alaikum, Saif. How are you doing?
Walaikum salam. I'm great. It's nice to be here with you guys.
Alhamdulillah. So tell us about yourself. I think a lot of people see Fawakih, have seen the institute, have seen them being online. But how did Fawakih start? Let's talk about that.
I think you have to go back to Indiana. So my father, he came to Indiana. That's something I always think about is how many decisions that seem small to us end up having this ripple effect, and they may change the course of our own lives and those of our families and others. And so he ended up going to a small college called Tri-State, which is now Trine in Indiana. And from there, our journey started in Indiana. And we grew up in a small town, very few Muslim families around, if any. And we were fortunate to have the ISNA headquarters 45 minutes away. So on the one hand, we were in a pretty normal, small town America growing up experience. And on the other hand, ISNA headquarters is 45 minutes away, and so there's big things happening nearby. So we kind of were between those two things, kind of a small town Muslim community experience, but then we were meeting these giants and visionaries and founders of a lot of the organizations in America, which I think inspired us early on to think beyond our local community and think more nationally, if not globally. The other key part about growing up, my parents made it a very key focus to stay connected to Pakistan. So they left everything behind and they came to the U.S. to start a new life. But we grew up, I was the oldest of four siblings, and so I grew up speaking Urdu, learning Urdu, whereas I know a lot of my friends, that wasn't a priority or focus in their families necessarily, but I valued that a lot. And so language was a part of my experience growing up. And I took Spanish in high school and French, and I did have a knack for languages. I think language allows us to connect to people, and for me particularly, it was a central part. Growing up speaking English at school and then speaking Urdu with my grandparents, and then we'd travel back religiously to Pakistan every other year. So I also had a connection to the Muslim world and to my cousins and relatives in Pakistan. Most of my family, some people like my wife's family, most of them are here in the U.S., so they have a large family. For us, most of our family was back in Pakistan, so going back was a way to reconnect. And I think that at some level gave me this exposure to the importance of connecting, of language, and gave me the confidence to really feel like we can look at Islam in a more global way.
That's awesome. And that was your own childhood growing up. Eventually, where did that lead you? I think you ended up in Michigan, and that was, I'd like to say, the nascent stages of your own Islamic awareness leading to you recognizing that there's a vacuum in the community.
Absolutely. And so I think a pivotal decision in my life, just like for my dad, it was going to college in the U.S. He came in as a teenager to the U.S., going to college at a time. And now that I look back at it, it was right after the civil rights movement. We're talking about the early 70s. So we're talking post Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali's heyday. And so that, now that I think about it, I mean, there was a lot of racism still in Indiana, and growing up, thinking back, we realized that, the U.S. was going through its own growing pains, and especially on how it dealt with race. So I think that did inform our experience and my parents' experience. And then for me, growing up, I always felt like the other. We were very few minorities in the small town of Fishers. We grew up in the suburbs of Indiana. Eventually, it became part of the suburbs. Initially, it was quite rural. And so I decided that I wanted to connect with the larger Muslim community and get out of my, experience in Indiana to broaden my experiences. So I went to Michigan. For people who know Michigan, there's a city called Dearborn that's very close to University of Michigan.
Dearborn Sharif.
Dearborn Sharif, yeah. and Dearborn is fascinating because it's like you go there and everything is in Arabic. You have Arabic, signs. People speak in Arabic. It's the largest concentration of Arabs outside of the Arab world. And so that on the one hand, and then a large population of immigrants from other parts of the Muslim world combined made University of Michigan a very interesting experience, given it's in that neighborhood. And so I had an amazing experience there, made a lot of friends, and I think that then sparked my my connections more nationally in terms of the Muslim community. I ended up becoming the president of the MSA there. I think I was the first non-Michigan president of the MSA, out-of-stater, as they call them. And so that was a key part of our experience. Yes. So before that, though, Minna played a key role. So Minna was an offshoot of ISNA. It was focused on the youth, Muslim youth of North America. So throughout high school, going to Minna camp, spending time outdoors was a key part of our upbringing, and then going to the ISNA conventions. So ISNA conventions were a place that I think was very pivotal for me. I'd look forward to it all year round. It was a situation in which you'd go to a city, there'd be thousands of Muslims on the streets, halal food. You'd basically feel like you're part of a broader ummah. And I think that sense of community at a national level really culminated at going to these conferences that were national in nature and making these connections that ended up being lifelong, both with the people we're listening to and learning from and speakers and scholars, but also with others we met as peers.
That's cool. And I'm thinking about it even from the perspective of growing up on the East Coast. I was in Hartford for the last 3 years, Hartford, Connecticut, and ICNA used to occur in Hartford, right? So from 2004 till 2014, we had ICNA happening there. And I didn't grow up going to ISNA because we'd go to ICNA. But exactly that feeling of having thousands of Muslims in one area, you're united by one thing or the other. But I think the thing that it comes down to is that there's something very deeply that binds us, which was the Arabic language, right? That's the truth of it. Like, we are distinct from other faith groups because of the fact that we have a book in which we can recite verbatim, not know what the meanings are, but at the same time, it's the same no matter where you go. And how did that play into, I guess, bringing Muslims together through the study of language? How did that kind of build your ideas of Fawakih?
So it's interesting. I took my first Arabic class, Arabic 101 at Michigan. And my professors, they were Jewish professors. They were secular Arabs. Raji Ramuni, in fact, was one of the first Arab professors in the United States. And he wrote the book, a number of books on Arabic, including this old orange book my parents actually studied. The earliest memory of me with Arabic was Dr. Ehsan Bagbi. Mm-hmm. He was in Indiana for ISNA, and he was my parents' Arabic teacher. So there was a small, rickety old mosque in the inner city of Indianapolis that he would teach this orange book, because he himself went to University of Michigan, interestingly enough, and he did his PhD there. And so it was very technical, like diptodes, and they had all the technical linguistic terms for teaching Arabic. And that's the foundation of how many of the older generations studied Arabic, was this very intense book. It was not even done on a computer. It was done on a typewriter, so you can see the typewriter, font and setup. And that was actually one of the key players of that was Raji Ramuni. And before the Georgetown's Fi Kitab al-Ta'lim Arabi, the Red Book, as they call it, this was the standard. So it was interesting that I ended up in Michigan, in where there was this history and legacy of Arabic. So I studied Arabic there. Mostly, I'll be honest, the reason I was studying Arabic there was to get a good grade, because I thought it'd be an easy A. And I was pre-med. All my friends, like my closest dozen friends at Michigan, they're all doctors now. We all went through pre-med together. So I took 3 semesters of that. But I think at some point I felt like, one, there was this amazing awakening that I had, having grown up reading Quran, not understanding what I'm reading, knowing some words because of Urdu, but with just a few semesters at University of Michigan, even though the curriculum was modern standard Arabic, it wasn't geared towards the Quran. I started seeing things in the Quran, and so that really piqued my interest. I'm very mathematical oriented. I was in math competitions in high school. I was very much into math. It's very structured and logical to me. And so Arabic I found very different from other languages in the sense that, Spanish was mostly spoken Spanish that I was speaking, and I think I was just good at it because I knew Urdu, and so my brain was hardwired to be able to switch between languages. But with Arabic, it was very systematic, and when I figured out how the structure of the verbs are and the verb charts, and there's 10 forms and there's patterns you can fit things in, it just immediately clicked. So given my, we had gone to Umrah, we had gone to Pakistan a number of times, but I'd never been to the Arab world outside of that experience. And for people who know Mecca and Medina, it's very different from the rest of the Arab world. It's kind of, they're very special cities, but they're also very structured in a certain way to allow a lot of people to come. So I ended up going to Morocco and did a study abroad. And that was very pivotal for me. So that sparked a series of trips I took abroad between a few months to, longest I stayed was in Syria, in which I deepened my understanding of Arabic. I, traveled and met scholars there and studied at their feet. And that was where the foundations of Fawakih and the idea of bringing something like that back to the U.S., in which, although I benefited and I loved that journey myself, it wasn't necessarily something that everyone could take. So, but the results was something that everyone needed.
Yeah. And then, so like one thing that I've been realizing with a lot of folks that have been involved with Fawakih is that there are so many preliminary stages that occurred that things were very nebulous, you could say. Things were still forming. And it came to a point where if you want to kind of put things in motion, put the rubber to the road, you need to just kind of get out there and start teaching. So I think Fawakih started in 2008, you had said, right? What did that look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it started off as a summer program. It was very organic. I had some teachers from Syria. I had started working at a consulting firm at that point. And the interesting story of that is that I had come down to DC to meet with a teacher and a scholar, Imam Majid, who's a very close advisor now at Fawakih, and he's been part of my journey in DC and generally in life for many years. I actually went to Hajj with him when I was an undergrad, and that's kind of sparked our relationship and has stayed since then. But I had come down to meet with him because I knew that the Adams community was growing. I loved the vision of that they brought, and I was wanting to work with him to support his initiatives, both in the community and in the political arena, given his connections in the government and the representation he brought in terms of helping Muslims find a vision for how they fit in the U.S. And how they interface with the society at large. So the reason I had taken the interview for this consulting firm is because they would pay for a ticket to come down to DC. I get to meet with Imam Majid. I interview with them. At this point, I was at Harvard doing grad school. This was after my time in Syria. I had come back to do a master's in public policy. And my focus was on nonprofit management because I knew from my studies abroad that we don't only need knowledge. So you see some books here. We have amazing scholars that I grew up listening to and learning from, but we also need vehicles and institutions that allow that knowledge to be disseminated and delivered in a way that's palatable and it's helpful for the audience in modern learners who are very visual. They require a different type of learning than the traditional approach, which is very poem driven. It's very memorization driven, which is great. And there are many people who have gone down that route, and it's a lifelong study. But for the majority of people who still need to access their primary sources of Islam to be able to do their prayers, to do their dua, to raise their kids, and in between things be able to get nourished with from the Quran, they needed some access to Arabic and some knowledge of the Quran that was deeper than what we can get with just our Sunday school education. So long story short, I come down for that reason, met with Imam Majid, and I still remember I was getting ready to sign an apartment and move down here in DC when I got a call from the consulting firm, and it wasn't working out on this end. The job wasn't working out, and then at the same time, the consulting firm, offered me a job, and it required me to move to Abu Dhabi. So I took that little detour, spent a couple years in Abu Dhabi. I was expecting a child on the way. So that's one thing I wanted to step back and think about, is that oftentimes we have these grandiose plans for ourselves, right? And we've seen people have gone through COVID now. We had this entire calendar set out of what we think life will look like. We have these detailed plans. We have these expectations, even how our marriages will look like, or how our kids will look like, or how our work will look like. And then things like COVID happen, or other hurdles come in our way that throw us off. But one lesson I take from this experience is, my intention was to come to DC. My intention was to work with Imam Majid and to serve both the local community and nationally to bring about solutions for the Muslim community that we direly needed. And I ended up going to Abu Dhabi, and it was a bit of a disappointment, but I needed the health insurance. They gave me a really good offer. They covered housing. They're flying me around in business class. I'm meeting with heads of companies, working directly with the royal family there, and it was an amazing experience. Not what I had planned on, but I had that detour, and I think the way the divine plan unravels and unfolds in our own lives, that there are reasons why those things happen,
Right.
and maybe I needed that time to develop some of the skills, reflect, spend some time in which, we were newly married, had a kid on the way. We got some time away from the U.S., got a different perspective living there. And then I think when I came back after that, I was more energized to work on this vision of Fawakih than I was before, and I was more equipped to do so. It was very organic. I saw a need. And that's something that I generally find myself doing, is observing, seeing what the needs are, see pain points, and seeing, what role can I play in solving it. There's so many problems we see in the world, and many people have concerns or have ideas. I think one thing that I try to do is I try to see where I can plug in and just play my little part in that. Yeah. And doing that over and over, eventually we get enough experience to see where we can really add the most value. So I saw that, more than becoming a scholar or a sheikh myself, which was my intention when I went abroad, was that, hey, we need knowledge. I need to go learn myself, improve my understanding of Islam, deepen that, and then bring that back and potentially teach. It's a very, basic way to look at what the needs were at that time.
I'll say this much too, that there was a time where when we talk about teaching people Arabic, that it was like, okay, well, the only way you can do this is that if you completely dedicate yourself, yes. You quit your job, you move with your family. And then when people didn't do that, they were looked at as not having the vigor to study or not having, the right intention. And now looking back on that, that was a very ridiculous proposal, right? To expect people, like, what type of faith is it that you have to uproot your entire self and your entire community and just move elsewhere?
Yeah.
So I think that's something, a vacuum that Fawakih started to fill. And I think during the era of 2008 or 2009, a lot of orgs had created, I think, institutions which would require you to move somewhere, which would require you to, again, just leave everything. And people that did that, good for them. Inshallah, they were able to really benefit, but you won't be able to scale something like that and keep it at a quality level. So I think, that's something you saw.
I think I had a wide range of experience. I did everything, right? I did the Allen program in Michigan. That's one of the things that led me to attending University of Michigan. As I said, I grew up with ISNA, with Mina, with the local mosque, Sunday school. I ended up going to, right before I went to Syria, I went to the Qasid program in Jordan and spent a summer in Jordan. And that was also set up by people who were inspired to go abroad. There was an entire community there of Westerners that were living in Jordan. Now there's places like that in Turkey and other places that Westerners live abroad. Some of them had been, when I was in Syria, some of them had been there for 5, 6, 7 years studying, right? They had been inspired by Sheikh Hamza Yusuf or another scholar. There were groups of students in Medina University as well. So there's this entire concept. Some were making hijrah to the Muslim world. Some were there to go study and become tulab al-ilm. They were very inspired. And that also, I was part of that kind of excitement to reconnect to the Muslim world, to go study there, have traditional learning. But as you mentioned, yes, scalability was a major factor. When I looked at the struggles I went through, just getting an apartment and living and surviving in a new country, there were so many hurdles. And then what I saw was when there were two types of people. There were people who gave up. They spent 6 months to a year. They had a nice study abroad experience and they came back and it was just a little blip in their life, right?
Mm-hmm.
There were others that just went local and they basically, as they call them, went native. You know, they started dressing like locals. They sometimes married, or they at least grew up in that lifestyle. They may spend 5, 7, 8 years there. They become fluent in the language and they do some studies, but in the end of the day, they end up with the same struggles that people who are local there struggle with their kids' schooling, with income sometimes. And so I didn't see either of those models sustainable and worth. You know, I'd given up a lot. You know, my friends were now in medical school doing residency. They're about to get really good jobs. They're trying to get married. And so I went through that kind of discussion in my mind. I've given up all that. I've kind of burned my bridges and have come abroad to study. What was this all for, right? And I personally was loving it. It was personally a great lifestyle, but I was away from my family, and I was very attached to my family. And then we started hitting some hurdles as well fairly soon after that we saw with the Arab Spring and some of the turmoil in the Arab world. And I started to think, hey, is this sustainable? Are people going to be able to continue to come to the Muslim world to study, or do we have to build our own institutions that can maybe more efficiently teach that same knowledge? Because I saw that there was a lot of inefficiencies in the way we were also learning and a lot of time wasted. And for me, the clock was ticking. And so one of the key underpinnings of Fawakih and one of the key goals that we had was making the learning accessible, both in terms of geographic location, but also one of the things that I always pray for is Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa'. That, oh Allah, we seek refuge. And this was always very interesting to me, that normally we seek refuge from bad things, right? We seek refuge from shaitan. We seek refuge from having arrogance, things like that. But this was seeking refuge from knowledge, right? But it's a specific type of knowledge that doesn't benefit us. So knowledge that doesn't translate into our reality, into our lives, and into our society. And so part of the filter I'm very passionate about is how can we teach the bare minimum that's going to have the maximum impact on people's lives? Because people have very little attention span, very little time, but it has to be something meaningful. And so I think that's the filter we use for Fawakih. And it led us to Arabic because we are already investing so much time with Arabic in our societies, in our worship, whether it's khutbah or if it's your prayer or Tarawih prayer. You're standing there for hours. You're already investing that time. So how can we be more efficient by getting more out of that time we're already investing? And for that reason, Arabic ended up being a very strategic tool. The other benefits I found, and some of this it was an ongoing process of learning as we started getting deeper and deeper into studying Arabic, because initially we were trying to take it all on, Arabic and Islamic studies. Eventually, we cut out Islamic studies from Fawakih and we focused on Arabic. That's something that I've learned on this journey is staying in your lane, being focused, and doing one thing really, really well, and let others take care of other pieces. And by being narrowly focused on Arabic, a few really interesting benefits came out. One, we're able to interface with universities because university Arabic departments, we now work with them. And our focus is classical Arabic, but we're able to interface with them because Arabic is very compatible with, foreign language learning generally. It's something that's normal. It's like karate, right? It's a very American thing to do is learn languages. So I think for Westerners, especially Western Muslims, to learn Arabic, we've had people who become Muslim and they don't take a Islam 101 class. They don't go to the mosque and learn about Islam, but they actually join Fawakih because for them to say, hey, I'm just taking a language class, it's a great way for them not to be preached at, not to be on their own journey. It's very empowering in that way that I'm taking control of my own learning. And through this, I can explore this vast tradition, which is transmitted in Arabic. I mean, if you look at it, the Arab world was just in the Arabian Peninsula during the Prophet Muhammad's time, but it ended up spanning, and Arabic is now, learned and taught, and even is the common language from Morocco to, many parts of Asia, right? And then even in Spain, it's surprising, but, a lot of the books that we study, Ibn Juzay, one of my favorite tafsir textbooks, or Qurtubi, his name is literal, the one of the largest tafsirs,
Cordoba.
volume Cordoba is from Cordoba, which is in Spain. And so Arabic became this language of learning, which I felt that if we get disconnected from as American Muslims, we lose out on a key value and a key, it's like a well that we can pull water out from, and we become we lose that grounding if we don't have that Arabic. So I think the strategy of Arabic, one, allowed us to interface with a wider audience. It wasn't as intimidating as teaching Islam and you're the official version of Islam. No, this is a language. It gives you tools and you can go do with it what you want, right? I think it also helped us, especially recently, but throughout, we've been very non-denominational in the sense that there's been Shia students that have come to Fawakih. There have been Sunni students. There are people who are inclined towards Salafi interpretations versus Sufi interpretations, madhabs, non-madhabs. I mean, it's been a very open platform because our teachers are pretty diverse, our student body is diverse, and the Arabic language brings people together. It doesn't split people apart as much because it is about the Quran, and everyone can benefit from that, right? Regardless of their background or what tradition, whether, Arabs come and they have some dialectical language that they know, but they're wanting to learn more classical Arabic so they can access the Quran. Non-Arabs come with maybe some languages that they have some words. We've had Turkish students and people that speak Urdu that are bringing that those vocabulary into the classroom. So it becomes a very rich experience in which we can all together in a very, in an inclusive way be able to learn. And it's, I think that one of the strategies for the future is that, you go through this experience together and we realize that the things that divide us are not as much as we think. And another point I wanted to actually touch upon is that one of the things that our teachers and many people warn us about is that you don't want to tell people, hey, you learn Arabic, now you can interpret the Quran. You learn Arabic, you don't need scholars anymore. You can just, you're independent. And, that is a concern that's there, that if the more people learn, they become arrogant or they feel like they know better than others. And we tested that out. And I think one of the key things about Fawakih that I've tried to instill is that let's be data driven. Let's use data to drive our decisions instead of our assumptions. And so that actually has been disproven from our experience. We've found that Arabic is the biggest, it instills this sense of humility in students. I mean, we come together to this language, and this language is vast, and it can be challenging at times, and it requires us to, when we're trying to speak Arabic or you're trying to learn Arabic, you're doing it as an elementary student. You're not doing, and we have PhDs that are coming to Fawakih. We have people that have achieved great things in this world, and they're coming and they have to submit themselves to the language. And I think that process itself, and the humility and the respect you have for people who actually traverse and master Arabic, is so high that it instills this sense of humility and reverence that is the opposite of what you would expect from people who come and learn, and then they feel like they can interpret the Quran. They don't need anyone else. It actually does the quite the opposite result.
That's cool. And I think that's what people end up realizing is that you end up coming to something. There was something that Sheikh Hisham Mahmoud said yesterday, which is that when it comes to the Arabic language, you have to give all of yourself to get just a little bit of it, right?
Yes.
And this is where I want to jump to the beginning stages. You said that Fawakih started as a summer camp, right? What was that about? Who was teaching then?
Yeah.
You know, what were the things that you took away from it? What are the things that you took away from that summer that basically ran all throughout?
Yeah. So first, we just experimented, and this is something that in business they call minimally viable product. I didn't know these terms back then. This was before I took any Harvard Business School classes, which I was fortunate to be able to take a number of when I was in Boston. But MVP is basically you take an idea and you test it out in smallest form. And so those summer programs were a great way for us to bring people together, for us to experiment. We were experimenting with curriculum. We were bringing different teachers together from different parts of the country. This was interestingly at the same time. I think there's certain times that things are set to happen. And this was the same exact year Zaytuna started its Arabic program. And the same exact year that Noman Ali Khan started his Bayna summer intensives. And we were all three of these institutions were in touch at that time, which is an interesting part of history. It was so I think there were moments in time that people come to a similar realization that there's a need that's there. And until this day, there are other institutions out there. There's also, we work closely with Arabic Daily, but these are the same players that are still impacting the Arabic, infrastructure in the U.S. till this day. So it was a very special time. I think it was some of the things that I learned from that was that, you can either build, buy, or borrow, right, your curriculum. And so initially we were borrowing it. The teachers came with their own curriculum. It's kind of like a potluck. Everyone brought their own curriculum.
I hope the food tasted better, though.
Yeah, right. And so the great thing about a potluck is that everyone brings their best dishes, and you kind of put it together and you share it. And a sense of community was formed through that. We started in Indiana, and so my family had been very involved in the community there. So we had a lot of local support. I think the key thing, people think, hey, this is about Saif. And I feel like from the beginning, Fawakih has never been about me, because the tremendous amount of infrastructure and support that we received in response, I think it was very much a community effort. A lot of the funding came from people in Indiana that helped subsidize the learning, creating scholarships, offering facilities for free. Many of our initial teachers and folks, they volunteered their time. And so I'm very, very appreciative of those early people, almost like the Badaris, right? That they gave so much of themselves and they sacrificed so much to get it off the ground. And then a lot of our staffing came from Michigan, actually. A lot of our key people who joined initially were people that I went to school with or I had a Michigan connection with. And the first full-time employee we had is now someone people know, Chris Blauvelt, who started LaunchGood. So I think there was this kind of time in which there were many different programs starting, and there was this interesting interlay between them in which we had a teacher that taught for us in the summer and then ended up getting a job at Zaytuna. We had students that studied with us and went to Dream. We had people who finished at the Dream program, and a number of folks that we actually ended up hiring at Fawakih. So I believe many people ask, who's your biggest competitor at Fawakih? And the approach we took was that we're at a very nascent stage of this industry, and all boats rise with the tide. That if you do well, then others, challenge themselves. They also speed up. We just went through the Olympics, and we see that they're usually great runners or great, players in any sport, they come in batches because they each push each other, and they become the reference point for each other, because it can be a very lonely business. So I never looked at the other institutions that we were with. We looked at them as partners, and that we're part of the same mission. And I think that really helped me not get into that very competitive business side, which you learn in the business schools, but working in a more collaborative way, in which we feel that everyone is trying to work towards a mission, and the more anyone else succeeds, it's going to end up helping us, because it's not about sharing the pie at this point. It's really about growing the pie, because it's so tiny that we're focused on, there's millions of American Muslims and there's billions of Muslims around the world, and they need this learning, and we barely have the infrastructure to serve a small sliver of them. So I think keeping that big perspective in mind help us navigate and not get into the rivalries and some of the tensions some institutions get into.
So on that point, what I wanted to ask you about was, it's not just the American or the Canadian or the British Muslim community where you have people who are students at Fawakih. Number one, how many students now have gone through Fawakih? And number two, what do you think your impact? What do you think an organization like Fawakih, their impact will be globally, in retrospect to now, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, things having moved online? And on top of that, Fawakih has been online before everyone was forced to move online. You can kind of craft that however need be.
Yeah, that's a great thing to think about. One is what I hear is thinking about how, world trends impact us. And I think we all, as individuals and institutions and businesses, we need to think about how the world, and as I grow older, I realize how much of it has to do with our environment and how much global trends are impacting us. So, and then this helps me pivot towards something I want to talk about, was that we went through Fawakih 10 years of in-person learning. So at one point we had 50 classes going on every week in 10 states. And it was a lot to manage. But that's what we believe. We believe that, hey, starting with the summer programs, this is about the relationship. This is about doing things in person. This is about, sitting at the feet of teachers and building a community of learning. And how can you build that when it's cold and online and remote? We didn't see that vision. And so for 10 years, we did that, right? And one story that highlights that is that we had teachers that we had moved. We had moved, actually, so Hisham had moved and was running our Chicago chapter. We had another instructor that we had moved to Chicago as well. And we had different cities with different chapters going. We had different local teachers that we'd have to hire, and then students would come together in the local areas and build learning communities for Arabic. And one time, we had 5 classes going on in Chicago, and one of our teachers wasn't able to teach that week. I can't remember what the reason was, whether they got sick or they had a family issue. And so we called another teacher from our Philadelphia chapter, and we said, we need somebody in Chicago to cover this week, or else we're going to have to cancel a week of classes with over 100 students. And so they immediately said, okay, I'm down. And early on, we had a lot of people, and to this day, we're very blessed to have very dedicated people to the mission and to Fawakih. And he grabbed a flight that evening, went to Chicago, and went through all the classes. And so we worked so hard to try to give that reliable service, but it was getting very hard to manage in so many different locations. But we kept at it until there was a way out. And the way out ended up being, we had started testing our online courses in 2015, just to see how we can reach more people.
Was that on like Zoom back then?
This was at like Join Me. I think one time we had used like WebEx, and then we went to Join Me. So we were using different technologies. So Zoom came very late. That was during COVID that we switched to Zoom, but we had used some precursors to Zoom before that. And we were actually flying our teachers to those locations, whether it's in Portland or Miami, so that they would have that personal interface for a weekend, and then they would go online. So there'd still be that relationship that was built. So it was a bit of a experimental thing, but I think one of the things I really value about Fawakih and our team is that we're continually experimenting, continually innovating, and letting the data, because there's a dream and then there's data, right? So my dream was, we'd have this like really like nice old mansion that people would come and live in and they'd study. And we lived out that dream. We had this Fawakih Manor for a number of years. It was right here in Virginia on a picturesque 11 acres. It was a Civil War era manor that we actually rented. Dr. Sohail Lahir was our dean. He lived there with his family. We had programs there. So we had that vision, and we had 10 years of programming in person. But when we launched that pilot, we realized that at the end of the day, the students were learning. The testing was coming at equivalent. And so we started understanding, how do we interpret that data? Why is it that students are learning, retention is actually better, and more people are signing up? And so we realized that there were some barriers. The same barriers that were there to go abroad were there in order to drive 20 minutes and go to a class every week for multiple years. Maybe people could pull it off for 6 months or a year, but long-term study with the lifestyles people had, they wasted too much time with the commute, and it was too difficult for people to access, and we couldn't reach the people we needed to. We'd have to set up hundreds. We'd have to be like Starbucks or McDonald's, and we didn't have the infrastructure to do that. And so by moving online, it was very difficult, and we flipped the switch fairly quickly, almost overnight, in which we basically transitioned everyone online. It was a very difficult decision, but I think that allowed us to be where we're at right now. If we hadn't made that and I think most of us as individuals and institutions, we have some of those pivotal decisions that you have to get right. And if you don't, it's just a slow death, right? And so I think, some institutions, they would compromise on something that was very core, like, or maybe that wasn't core to them. They may have, a lot of people told us, why don't you expand to Arabic, not just Quranic Arabic, not just classical Arabic. We decided
like spoken Arabic?
Spoken Arabic.
Okay.
Go to spoken Arabic, go to modern standard Arabic, and own the Arabic space. But I dug back, and I'm like, discussed with our team, that's not our niche. Our niche is Quranic Arabic, and there's no reason why there isn't enough of a need for that, because most Muslims you meet, they want to understand the Quran. And so we said this, if you want to think in business terms, this market or the need or the impact we could have can be huge. Whereas there are other institutions doing just Arabic. Universities can handle that area. We need to be specialized in that. So instead of diverting from that mission, we had to divert from the dream I had of having a beautiful place in which people could come, live, and study. Had to get rid of that dream because the data just was not adding up, and had to pivot and say, hey, we're going to go after the impact by reaching more people with this, because people are benefiting, and the data is showing that they're going to benefit online even more. And so that move we made, I think, was a great opening for us. It allowed us to reach more people. The experiences, we were able to focus on the curriculum, getting it, investing more into the curriculum, having videos that supplemented, and allowing it to build into people's lives instead of pulling them out of their lives in order to expect them to learn.
So, Saif, what does the future of Fawakih look like? Because there's a lot going on, related to the curriculum being adopted by Harvard Seminary, by the University of Chicago's Divinity School. And I think we mentioned student numbers. You've had over 2,000 students in person and online. So what's the future of Fawakih looking like?
Well, I want to share an interesting story that I thought of. It's a little tangential, but one of our summer students, she came from Indonesia. So this was our first student that came
to America.
From
Indonesia.
This is in the first 10 years of Fawakih, we had residential programs. And she came from Indonesia, and we were just all shocked. So that all the students went to the airport to meet her. And it was funny because I think she had a stopover in the UAE or someplace in the Arab world on the way over. And we were joking. We're like, this person is coming from Indonesia. She's flying literally over or stopping in the Arab world and coming to Washington, D.C. to study Arabic, skipping over the Arab world. And so it was very fascinating to us to see something like that. But it reminded, and she was an amazing person. She had been an executive at a large firm, multinational, and she had ended up getting very sick. So she came on a wheelchair.
Oh, wow.
And she didn't know how long she had. And so she was such a diligent student, and she had covered level 1, and at the end of the level, at the kind of ceremony to end, she had an entire 2 pages she had written in Arabic, and she read that out for everybody, and
Wow.
people had tears in their eyes.
How long was that program that she
That
came?
program was 1 month.
Wow.
It was 1 month program. So there were some pretty amazing relationships that were built at these in-person programs, which amazingly now we even when you transfer online, there's still amazing culture and connections that are made online just with the students. A story to underpin that, when Dr. Sohail Lahir, one of our teachers, had a stroke, and he was it was a very serious stroke, and the entire Fawakih community was very affected by this, and the students were affected, his students particularly. There was a student from Turkey who was in Colorado, and he was after me. They said, I have to visit my teacher. I have to visit my teacher. And he had only studied with him online, but still that common experience of going through Arabic creates this bond between the students and between the teachers that I think is very special. So he ended up taking that online relationship, and he flew to Boston to meet Dr. Sohail Lahir.
Wow.
And so I feel like sometimes those relationships start in person and they go virtual. And sometimes the virtual relationships, they start virtual, but then they also manifest in our lives. Going back to the story, that led us to think, why is somebody not going to the Arab world and coming here? And then obviously we had, now 2,000 students, 1,000 in the first 10 years in person, and then another 1,000 online in the last just 3 years.
That's quite impressive.
Yeah, so alhamdulillah, we've been able to reach more people and expand and scale out because of the online model.
Let me ask you this. They always talk about in business and in investing, to get your first millions the hardest, right? But then after that, it kind of just falls in because you've created a culture within yourself. You've created good habits. What were some of those things within Fawakih that you, as a founder, as a CEO, have kind of instituted, within the culture of Fawakih that is allowing for that to happen?
I think one key piece from the very beginning that you may find different about Fawakih than other organizations is that we wanted to be sustainable and replicable and scalable. Yeah. That was from the very beginning.
Which will go to my other point, which is that you don't see marketing. You don't see sponsored ads on Instagram, right, for Fawakih.
Yeah. So, marketing has been something we haven't invested as much into. We wanted to invest into the product, into the content, into the experience. Partially, it wasn't a strategy. It was more just my background, my interest, as well as the people we brought on. We mostly brought on people who are more into the academics. And so we were working on the product. Now, in order to reach more people, you definitely have to have a brand. You have to have a reputation. You have to be able to reach people in different channels. And so there is a future for that and us to be able to reach more people. But I think a key part of it was that we wanted, if you look at Fawakih instructors even, they're not always the celebrity teachers. They're not always the most charismatic, the ones that can awe you or can make an audience, crack up laughing. I saw that there were so many valuable teachers out there that were not being taken seriously because they didn't have good stage presence, or they didn't have didn't have their own podcast, etc. But there were valuable, talented people, and a key part about Fawakih from the very, very beginning, that kind of our value set, is unlocking potential, right? And we unlock potential that we have in ourselves through the curriculum and being able to unlock the Quran and understanding the Quran and the language, and something that people feel like they're not able to do, but they see that within a few classes, within a few levels, they're able to access the Quran that they never thought was possible. So it's really creating these possibilities, but then also unlocking potential in people. So I think one of the things I'm most proud about are the people that have been part of Fawakih, this team, the staff, the volunteers, the teachers, all these hundreds of people that have been in part of this endeavor, that the goal is that they leave with a little bit more understanding or learning or potential than they came in with. And so I think that's helped us because it was never about a specific teacher or a specific staff member or a personality. It's been a lot more about the content, and I think that brings the right people and the right intentions to the organization. And the students that come, they're not coming because they're wanting a a big wow moment or a big aha moment. They want to be entertained. They're coming because they want to put in the work. It's like going to the gym, right? You're going to have to put in the work in order to get the results. And so I think that's how we've been able to attract the right people.
Nice. And then coming back to what the future holds, right? That was kind of a side point, but
yeah. So basically, one of the things that Sherman Jackson taught us, he said that we're positioned we all have to look at where we are positioned and what time we're in, what place we're in, and being in the U.S. When I go back to Pakistan to visit my family, everyone is just like enamored by the West. They're enamored by, taxi drivers ask us, how can you get us a visa, right? And so there is a unique position we're put in a world stage and a pedestal by being in the U.S. So Sherman Jackson had told me that if I publish a book in the U.S., it will be translated into dozens of languages. So the Muslim world is looking at us. Ironically, many Muslims growing up in the U.S., they want to go to the Muslim world and go study, which is great. And there's amazing tradition and there's great scholarship. And we don't want to look down upon the Muslim world. I think that's a very dangerous trend we have of this elitism that comes from this kind of Western
American
elitism, exceptionalism.
Yeah.
That I think that humility is very much needed, and the ability to learn from other societies and other cultures, but also realizing that we play a leadership role in the world. And so I think now we're going to start seeing institutions and products that are developed in the U.S. We see that in the material side, but also even in the spiritual side, in the meaning side, in institutions, in language, in education, that's now going to start trickling back and benefiting even the Muslim world. And there's going to be this healthy exchange. We're seeing that with our online courses. We have students joining from dozens of countries. Majority is still the U.S. and our focus is still Western, because that's the curriculum is built for a English-speaking Western audience. But with globalization, with different countries, every time we visit the Muslim world or other parts of the world, we're seeing that there are more and more commonalities because they're all on Facebook. They're all experience the same type of media. Those barriers are being reduced. And so we are seeing people from Japan, from Malaysia, from Turkey, from the UK, of course, is very common culturally with American values and education system. And then we're seeing, now from South America, from Africa, from Pakistan and India, students are joining. So that's something that we could look forward to in the future, is a more global classroom. We are still focused that we just scratched the surface, I believe, in terms of the need in our local area. And I think that's what we always were taught growing up, is that even when seeking learning or knowledge or opportunities or paying zakat, you should always look at the local and then have these concentric circles to go out. And I think that's what we focused in on, is trying to fill the needs as close to home as possible with our families, first and foremost, going out to our communities. And then as we can benefit more and more, the goal is not to become global. The goal is just to benefit people in the best way we can. And people we trust, people we can relate with, we can probably connect with better than people who don't know us. And so I think as we've come along so far, it's always about organic growth and just reaching people and going after, I always love the story about in the Quran about the blind man, right? There's a blind man that came to the Prophet ﷺ to come and earnestly wanting to learn. And the Prophet at that time was busy with the heads of Quraysh. And he knew strategically that those heads of Quraysh, if they become receptive to the message, one, others will be able to join because they're actively stopping others from joining. Two, it was a branding thing, right? That there's this prestige that comes with certain people coming to Islam. I mean, when Khalid bin Walid came to Islam, when Omar al-Khattab came to Islam, when certain key people come to Islam, it makes a difference. And so it was a very noble intention, and that's important, right? Because there are leaders that influence others that come. But this blind man, and we learned that lesson, was so special that the attention given to that person who was coming and earnestly seeking was a lot more important than anything that you could do to go out and get the influencer to join your cause. And so hopefully we can keep that value of serving those who are really seeking. I've seen people who come in on scholarship. We have a robust scholarship program at Fawakih. And some of the people who are the most sincere, the most dedicated, the most wanting to learn are those who are coming in on scholarship, and they benefit. And some of those are also the ones that we expect to become teachers, because one of the key things about Fawakih is that that you have to, is a give and take. You know, kullukum ra'in wa kullukum mas'ulun an ra'iyati. Right, everyone is a shepherd, and you're responsible for your flock. So that teach back mechanism of, if you're coming here to learn, that you're also going to be expected to teach. You teach your kids, you teach your families, you teach your communities. There's somebody out there that's dependent on you. And I feel that keeps the, knowledge just like water flowing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not stagnant, because I feel like going back to that, give us beneficial knowledge. Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa', that the more we can help others with the learning we have, whether it's one nugget of wisdom and we get excited about and we share it with friends and we help others, that ethos of learning, but not for a selfish reason, but to actually benefit and transform ourselves and others, is I think a key part of what makes this learning sticky, is that it doesn't just stay with us. And I felt that was part of the reason I personally, you see all these books around that I brought back, and I studied some of them. But I felt this huge responsibility that whatever I learn, whether it's little or a lot, that there must be a communal benefit for it. It can't just end with me. It's very, not just selfish, but I felt like a huge responsibility for me. So my goal is that everyone who benefits from Fawakih, that they feel that responsibility, that whatever they learn has been passed down from generations and from many teachers and a lot of sacrifice that people have made, that we should feel that responsibility, that it's kind of like a baton race, that you receive that baton, you pass it on to someone else. And I think that's really what allows this knowledge to stay relevant and to spread. And everyone feels empowered and part of the process, and not just a recipient and a passive recipient. And I think one of the values we try to instill in our instructors as well, and I'm really proud of our team and our instruction team, that everyone views themselves as a student and a teacher, right? On both sides of the mic, right? So personally, when I've taught at Fawakih, I've had limited stints of teaching. I've been mostly focused on the organizational level, but what I valued the most was that I learned more in the classroom teaching than I ever did in a classroom when I was learning. And the reason is that you're challenged by your audience. You're as good, a teacher is as good as their students. And so because we bring in amazing people, and we have people that are very successful, surgeons and professors and educators and parents who have gone through a lot of experiences with their kids, retired folks, people from all walks of life, and they bring a piece of themselves into the classroom. They challenge the instructors, they ask questions, and so that communal aspect of it is really great and opens eyes to people who have even been teaching Arabic for many, many years. They're always learning something new. And it's kind of like the Quran. You could read it 100 times and you get something new out of it. And so learning Arabic is that kind of lifelong journey that both the instructor and the students in the class are both learning and teaching at the same time.
And the last question I wanted to ask you before we end is, how did you come up with the name Fawakih?
So we were actually going to be called Miftah, which is a very generic Arabic name, which means key, to open. So the idea is that Arabic is the key of learning, right? Because in Islamic learning, if you learn Arabic, you can now access the Quran, you can access the Hadith, you can access so much, 1,400 years of tradition. And right when we were about to launch, the week we were about to launch, another institution, they launched an Arabic program called Miftah. And so we had to change our strategy. It ended up working out for the better. So my brother, actually, he's great at naming. He has so many more names of institutions than he has institutions that he's ever worked with, right? So he's like a graveyard of names of institutions that if you can just pluck it. So alhamdulillah, Fawakih was able to be plucked, and it didn't.
It's like sitting on a domain name that you want to buy.
Well, he does. He buys domain names for fun. So if you are a celebrity, it's likely that he owns your domain name. and that when he make it big, he's going to sell it to you or give it to you or something. So he bought SafeOmar.com. I never used it. I'm like, what am I going to do with SafeOmar.com? But he's just funny like that. So he's great at naming things. He's very deep and has a, into analogies and things like that. So he said, why not Fawakih? And so at that point, Fawakih.com was available. I was like, okay, let's go for it. It was just a summer program. I never thought it would become an integral part of my career or life. I was a volunteer for Fawakih for the first number of years. And so Fawakih means fruits. And so the idea was that, going back to that beneficial knowledge, is that the best trees are the ones that produce fruit. They're the ones that you can actually benefit from them. You can take something from that, you can nourish yourself. And so the idea about Fawakih was that, one. And then two, going back to the discussion about amplifying and multiplier, that fruits, amazing thing is that they have seeds. And then you can take a seed and you can plant another tree. And so then there is this ripple effect. There's this continuity. There are trees out there, and there's certain olive trees, for example, that the person who plants it doesn't really benefit from them. It's intergenerational, and so it's really thinking about what can we do that is gonna benefit people from the long term. And I think that's one of the things I was wanting to mention that I didn't yet, is that some people say, why do we need to learn Arabic, right? Everything's translatable. We can get translations. We get great translations now. Even books, most books are now translatable. There's great people like Aisha Bewley and others that are prolific translators.
There's actually, I don't know if you heard about this, there was actually a discussion on social media as of recent, talking about whether you really need Arabic to study in an Islamic studies program. Like, do you really need it?
Do you really need it?
Yeah.
Yes. And there are people that make that argument. They say that just like Urdu and Farsi and these languages were all part of the Muslim tradition, and scholarship was written in those languages. And, even for PhD students, they often learn German because there's a lot of work done in German, that English has become like that language. There's so many books written in English that are native to English, that why would you actually need to learn Arabic? And it's a broader argument. I don't know if I'll convince anyone, but for me, somebody who's not Arab, somebody who learned Arabic starting in college, the depth and the beauty of the language, and the fact that it was chosen for the Quran, and the Quran is in that language, is enough to say that in order to really go deeper into scholarship as a society, we're not thinking about individuals as much as a society even, that you need to have access to its roots, or else you're handicapped. If you want to renew, refresh and reinvigorate your understanding of Islam, you have to have access to the very roots, because language is so key to human beings. It's not like anything else. It's something that defines us. Subtleties in language are very hard to perceive unless you really study the language. And there's this aspect of submitting that is in Islam, and I think submitting ourselves to the language and submitting ourselves to the Quran as it is, without it being tainted by human interpretation and translations, I think it's very critical for us to keep the source of the spring pure and clear, so that generations, as they come, they can continue to nourish themselves and get that pure source that they can tap into. And we have a narrow window of time for American Muslims to be able to do that, because I sometimes view it as like, there's a ship, and then you're on like a little boat and you're sailing away from that ship. Because with every generation, I think about it with my own kids. I mean, are they really going to learn Urdu? I mean, they understand Urdu. Are they going to speak Urdu? Are they going to speak to their spouses in Urdu, or their kids? Are my grandkids going to ever visit Pakistan like I would visit? I mean, we go less and less as time goes on, because we have less and less relatives there. Are our grandkids going to ever go there? And now, even in my own family, there's so many marriages between different ethnicities that you won't even maybe view yourself as from a specific country. You go to South Africa, people may have Malay roots, they may Cape Malay, or they may have Indian roots, but they're very disconnected from those places now, and they form their own identity, their own culture. But then what is given up and what's kept at the end of the day? And for me, if they gave up wearing a sherwani for their shadi, I'm okay with that. If they don't speak Urdu, I'm okay with that. If my descendants, they don't you know, visit, Pakistan where we're from, or if they don't eat certain types of food, or the recipes don't get passed down, it'd be nice, but it's not absolutely essential. But if they don't have a connection to the Arabic language, they lose their connection to revelation. And so I think that's really where we draw the line. We have to do that hard work of establishing those things that are non-negotiable versus those things that are that can come and go, and they're nice to haves. So I think that's one area that relates to protecting access to the Quran that is non-negotiable, and we can't take shortcuts in.
Got it. This has been a wonderful discussion. I'm glad that we were able to do this to give people, students, supporters, and non-students also a perspective as to how Fawakih formed. This has been a great episode with the CEO of Fawakih, Saif Omar. Definitely check him out on social media. And at the same time, make sure you register for your first Fawakih class very soon. Take care, everybody. This is Nihal Khan signing off. Assalamu alaikum.